One of the worst things that can happen when you're talking to someone in English is when the topic of the conversation simply dies out, and then you're left with that dreaded silence. I know it can be quite uncomfortable. So in this episode, I want to share with you 7 tips that you can implement to keep the conversation flowing in English. Stick around. Hey there, how's it going? Thiago here, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. Before I give you the tips for today, let me know in the comment section below. Have you ever had an uncomfortable conversation in English? How did you manage through it? Let me know your experience here in the comment section. I'm curious to know. But anyway, tip number 1, whenever you find yourself having a conversation in English with a person, how can you ensure that the conversation keeps going? Well, tip number 1 is by asking questions, obviously. But it's not just about asking any kind of questions. Much better for you to ask open-ended questions, okay? If you don't use open-ended questions, you risk asking yes or no questions, and then the person might answer your question with a simple yes or no. That is not very encouraging to keep the conversation happening. So open-ended questions are questions that usually begin with WH words like what, where, when, who, how. Those questions are more interesting because the person has to answer them at least with one sentence. So instead of asking, did you have a good weekend? To which the person could reply simply yes or no, try asking, what did you do last weekend? How was your weekend? What was the highlight of your weekend? These open-ended questions encourage the person to share more details with you. And in doing so, the person might even mention other topics that you could refer back to later in the conversation. All right? After asking open-ended questions, I would also suggest asking follow-up questions. This is tip number 2. When someone shares something with you in a conversation, ask follow-up questions to dig deeper. Ask for more details. This is great because it shows that you are genuinely interested in what the person has to say, and it also helps to keep the conversation progressing naturally. So going back to the question about the person's weekend, imagine the person shares with you something like, oh, the weekend was great. I went hiking last weekend. Then you could ask, for example, nice. Where did you go hiking? What was the trail like? What was the weather like? You see, these are follow-up questions encouraging the person to share more details about that first piece of information. Tip number 3, show interest and listen actively. You can do so by nodding, smiling, making eye contact, because these things show that you are engaged in the conversation. You can also use phrases like, that's interesting, sounds nice, wow, tell me more. You see, this shows the person that you are following along and that you are invested in what the person is sharing with you. Tip number 4, you can also share your own experience. Don't be afraid to share your own stories and experiences related to the topic of the conversation. This helps to keep the conversation balanced because ideally both parties should be speaking with the same frequency or similar frequency, but also it helps to build rapport with the other person. When you build rapport with the other person, you establish a good relationship. You find things in common, and then you have an enjoyable interaction. Tip number 5, bridge to new topics. It's normal in a conversation sometimes you are talking about something and then that topic naturally runs dry or starts to die out. When you sense that this is happening, try to smoothly transition to another topic. You can connect the current topic to something that was just said by the person, or you can bring up something completely different to keep the conversation going. For example, speaking of hiking, have you ever been camping? So this phrase is very useful. Oh yeah, speaking of which, or speaking of this topic, what about this? Have you ever done this? You see? Or you can also go, oh, that's cool. That reminds me of a funny story that happened to me many years ago. And then you start sharing your own story. You see? So when you feel like the conversation is dying out or starting to die out, just transition to another topic. All right? The next tip number 6, don't be afraid of silence. It's okay if there are brief moments of silence. It's natural in any conversation. Use these moments as a chance to gather your thoughts or come up with a new question to ask the person. This can be particularly challenging if you are more of an anxious person. If you are more anxious as a person, I know going through that moment of silence, that pause that only lasts a few seconds but feels like hours, is really uncomfortable. But it's important that you become comfortable with this pause, with this silence, because it's normal in any interaction that you're going to have with people. So be comfortable with pauses and silence and use those moments to gather your thoughts and start talking about a new topic or to come up with another question to ask the person. So embrace the pause. Tip number 7, obviously, practice, practice, practice. The more you talk in English, the easier it will become. So find opportunities to chat with people, to learners, to native speakers, to teachers. And of course, don't be afraid of making mistakes because you are practicing your conversational skills, your fluency in the language. So engage in conversation any chance you get. I know I said 7 tips, but I actually want to give you a bonus tip because sometimes you might meet a person and you might be having a conversation with this person that is not really going anywhere. And then you try to do all these things. You try to ask the person open-ended questions, ask follow-up questions. You try to sound interested, you smile, you nod, you embrace the pause that happens sometimes. You share stuff about yourself. You do all this stuff. And after doing all this stuff, if you still feel like the person is not really engaged in the conversation or not sharing as much, then, my bonus tip is just let it go and maybe go find someone else to talk to, because at the end of the day, it's the other person's problem. It's not your problem. So don't be too hard on yourself. You might just be talking to a person who is a terrible communicator, who doesn't know how to have a conversation, an exchange. And that happens quite often, guys. So if that happens to you, after you've tried to keep the conversation flowing, just let it go and go find another person who will hopefully be more interesting to talk to. All right? Because at the end of the day, guys, a conversation between 2 people or more people should be, let's say, 50-50, right? It's like a tennis match. You throw the ball, you serve the ball to your partner should serve the ball back at you. If your partner doesn't serve the ball back at you, there's no game. There's no play. It's just like a conversation. If you are the one who is always asking questions, who is always trying to learn more about the person, but the person never asks you any question back, or the person doesn't seem interested in learning more about you, that is not the best person for you to engage in conversation with. Just move on to the next person. That can happen. Okay. Maybe that person needs to work on their communication issues. Okay. So that's my bonus tip. If this happens to you, if you meet a person like that, don't be too hard on yourself, because remember, a conversation should always be a two-way street. I hope you found this episode useful. Thank you so much for listening. A free way for you to support my work is by subscribing to the channel here on YouTube, liking this video, leaving a comment, and also sharing this video with your contacts. If you are on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you can leave me a 5-star review on those platforms. And if you want to take your relationship with me a step further, I would recommend checking out my private community. You can join my private community and have access to me, other learners, and some cool bonuses in the process. And also check out my pronunciation course. All the links are here in the description of the video and also in the show notes on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Guys, I'm Thiago. I'm signing off. Thank you very much. And I'll be talking to you very soon in the upcoming video.